Hundreds of Indian student graduates have staged protests against a new federal policy in Canada that puts them at risk of getting deported from the country. Hundreds of Indian student graduates have staged protests against a new federal policy in Canada that puts them at risk of getting deported from the country. In fact, many international students, especially from India, had high hopes of starting fresh in Canada. But new immigration changes have thrown a big curveball for over 70,000 graduates. Indian students have been camping out in front of the Legislative Assembly in Prince Edward Island for over 3 months, and protests are now also popping up in Manitoba and British Columbia. So what exactly is changing? Well, the Canadian government is slashing permanent residency nominations by 25% and putting stricter limits on study permits. This actually comes as Canada has been experiencing rapid population growth. In fact, 97% of last year's increase was due to immigration. And then with local housing and job issues heating up, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government is under pressure to cut back on temporary residence. Plus, they're rolling back their 2022 decision to expand temporary foreign worker permits, as we've extensively reported as well. These permits are meant to help fill short-term labour gaps, but now there's a new focus on reducing the influx. Canada is cutting back on temporary foreign workers, reversing a 2022 expansion, and this program, which actually helps fill short-term labour gaps, will see fewer permits issued now, because in 2023, Canada granted about 183,800 temporary foreign worker permits, which was an 88% jump from 2019. However, I must inform our viewers that the Employment and Social Development Canada Department has called out employers for misusing the program to avoid hiring local talent. But these new rules will now deny work permits in these areas where unemployment is 6% or higher, though there are exemptions for key sectors like agriculture, food processing, construction and healthcare. Listen in to what Justin Trudeau had to say.
This fall, we'll be presenting for the first time an immigration levels plan that doesn't just talk about permanent residents, but also talks about temporary residents, whether it's foreign workers or others. And we're making sure that the entire package makes as much sense as possible for the needs of Canadians and for the needs of our economy. That's why the first steps we're taking today of reducing the number of low-paid temporary foreign workers that can come work in this country is part of the response.
Meanwhile, in a major crackdown against migration, Australia, in addition to Canada, has also introduced new laws to cap Indian migrants. Now, with these new migration restrictions in Australia and Canada, avenues for Indian migrants are limiting foreign opportunities for students as well as workers. The big question now is, will these moves open up alternative education and employment hubs elsewhere? Well, here's our report.
In a major crackdown against migration, Australia and Canada have introduced new laws to cap Indian migrants. In a bid to rein in record levels of migration that have increased house rental prices, the Australian government has announced to limit its foreign student intake to 270,000 next year. The move is set to have a considerable impact on Indian students going abroad for higher education.
गवर्नमेंट है वो स्टूडेंट्स के बारे में इतना नहीं सोचती कि वो इतना बड़ा लोन लेते हैं. जैसे बाहर जाने के लिए पहले वीज़ा आता है, वीज़ा के लिए उन्होंने अप्लाई करते हैं तो लोन चाहिए होता है, एजुकेशन लोन. तो जो फाइनेंशियल लोन लेंगे हम, उस पर जो हमारी घर है, घर का लोन लेंगे, घर पे लोन लेंगे, किसी ना किसी पर लोन लेंगे.
मैं ऑस्ट्रेलिया में जाना चाहती हूँ एंड ये डिसीजन देख के ऐसा लग रहा है कि गवर्नमेंट को इसके ऊपर थोड़ा ध्यान देना चाहिए. मेरा करियर कहीं ना कहीं वो अफेक्ट कर रहा है उसे, और जो लोन्स ले रही है मेरी फैमिली और यहाँ का खर्चा, मैं एक्चुअली हरियाणा से बिलोंग करती हूँ.
In an unprecedented move, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has also announced to tighten the rules around the temporary foreign worker program. Starting next month, Canadian businesses will only be allowed to fill up to 10% of their workforce with low-wage foreign workers, down from the previous 20%. This decision comes in response to the rising unemployment rates in the country and right after the UN released a report alleging that the program was a breeding ground for contemporary slavery. In a social media post uploaded by the Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau stressed that the labour market has changed tremendously in recent years, which has shifted the focus on Canadian workers and youth. With new migration restrictions in Australia and Canada, avenues for Indian migrants are limiting foreign opportunities for students and workers. The question now arises, will these moves open up alternative education and employment hubs elsewhere? Samia Afsar for NDTV World.
Meanwhile, the